Hi everyone, welcome back to this afternoon session of Matter and Memory. It's my immense pleasure, it's our all immense pleasure to now introduce the amazing S. Devlin. I was mentioning earlier today that when we chose the theme Matter and Memory, of course a reference to the book of Henri Bergson in 1896, it was his idea that there are so many possible connections from body-spirit relation to sustainability, to memory and time, and I think all of these connections resonate deeply with S's work. And it was already last year when we actually discussed a dialogue with S's work when we had the theme of long duration, because of course so many of S's work have to do with that, thinking about the recent projects with trees. I was thinking the whole morning how to introduce the incredibly complex practice of S, because there are just so many dimensions to it. So I thought the best would be to introduce S with her own words, because when asked by Markus Fers recently in an interview to actually define her practice, S said, "I'm a designer, I'm an artist, I'm a director who works across a range of fields, including large-scale architectural works, gallery installations, theater, opera, and also concerts." When we met for the first time, it was actually thanks to Jefferson Heck, our friend many years ago, as was mostly working, of course, with theater from the very beginning, but also with amazing architecture for concerts, music, architecture for music, as has since then done a lot also in the art world, among them structures at the Serpentine Galleries, but of course also gone into architecture, into buildings, actually last year with the English Pavilion at the Expo in Dubai, and of course also big immersive participatory installations. We're going to talk about that, like the mirror installation at SUPERBLUE in Miami, which was the first project at the launch of that at the end of last year. Please give a very warm welcome to S. Devlin.
Oh.
Thank you so much. And before we start, as it would be great that you could tell us a little bit about what we're going to see in the background, because this is a very special moment. It's actually the first time ever that you're going to show us these sketches. Can you tell us more?
Well, I'm going to ask Jeremy, would you mind? Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Jeremy, do you mind just going back and holding on that first slide before you start the loop? Would that be okay? I dug out a bunch of sketches, and I haven't shown any of them before. And the first one, oddly, is a sketch that I did when I was about 18 years old. And weirdly, I think most of what I've concerned myself with in the ensuing numbers of years probably relates to the series of sketches I did on a given day. And then we're going to let the sketches loop, and you'll see. Yeah, this was the page from that day, and you can see, you'll see the connection to other things later. But the sketches are just going to loop. Some of them relate to projects that you'll see photographs of. And we made a decision that rather than keep referring back to them, we're just going to talk, and you'll see the sketches looping behind. And I think the connections hopefully will dissect and intersect in interesting ways. Thank you, Jeremy. Looping is good now. Thank you.
So maybe to begin, actually, I wanted to ask you about what happened on New Year's Day in 2022, because actually it has to do with Eduardo Chillida. And I was very fascinated to get your New Year's message. You had seen at the very end of last year a Chillida exhibition, and you were very moved by his words about the line and the drawing. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there? Because it's deeply connected with what we see.
Yeah, this is thanks to my dear friends Hedvig and Ed, who are here, who took me to Hauser and Wirth in Somerset, where I hadn't been before. I stayed the night in one of the houses on the street there, and it was full of books, and I didn't sleep. I just stayed up all night in this library, let loose, and of course read most of what Hans had written about the work of the drawing practice of Phila de Barlow. And he asked her a really interesting question. He said, in relation to the sculptures that you make, when do you draw? And she said, I draw before, I draw during, and I draw after. And I thought that was such an interesting question to ask myself and to ask any one of us who draws and makes. What is the purpose, and what is the energy, and what is the tone, and what's the relationship between drawing and making? And why would you continue to draw once the making was done? And then, in conjunction with that, we had just visited the extraordinary Eduardo Chieda exhibition, and I had read the line that he says, which is so piercing, when he says, the world is united in a line, the world is divided by a line, drawing is both beautiful and dreadful. So that referred me back to the drawing practice and trying to weave it back into the very collaborative making practices that I'm engaged in.
The other thing which was included in your New Year's message was a reference to our friend Timothy Martin, the philosopher, and you said that actually rather than preaching to people as how to change their behavior, artists need to amaze us into a perspective shift and therefore a behavioral shift.
I mean, it's something that I think resonates with all of us when faced with making work and when faced with the climate crisis that we know we're facing. What can we do? How can we be of any use? And any of you who've seen the film Don't Look Up, I think many of us feel that there's a danger of just being the Ariana Grande character and just sort of decoratively singing around the subject. And Timothy Morton wrote a manifesto for artists in which he said the role of the artist is not to preach, not to try and teach, but to try and amaze people into changing their mind. And Toni Cade Bambara said a similar thing when she said the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. So that sort of place of irresistibility and amazement, coming from a practice of theatre and magic and illusion, I felt at least I might have something to offer, I guess.
And then, of course, that shift, that perspective shift Timothy talks about made me think also of Memory Palace, the amazing installation I saw of yours at Pitzhanger Gallery, because that really included such a radical perspective shift. But not only that, it also connects deeply to the Bergsonian theme here of memory and matter, kind of the idea also of Bergson, of memory being something actually in neuroscience. I mean, it's fascinating that neuroscience kind of caught up with Bergson more and more, thinking that memory is not something static, but memory is a dynamic process, is always becoming. And of course, in this piece, you connect also to a very long durational perspective. What I meant before, that you connect to last year's theme, because it goes from early cave drawings really to Greta Thunberg today. Can you tell us about Memory Palace and how you connected there memory and matter?
Well, firstly, when I was about 16 years old, an English teacher gave me a book, and it was called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. And some of you may be aware of it. It was, simply the mnemonic techniques, which were pre-computational systems of memory, which were very impressive, almost magical. And around the time of 2017, I was becoming more and more, anxious about how could I have any positive impact on what I was reading around climate. And I made this Memory Palace piece partly as an act of sort of consolation, I hope, to me, my studio, and hopefully to those who would see it. And we tried to console ourselves by reminding ourselves of times in history when humans have changed their minds or shifted their perspectives about things. And there are 10 of us in the studio, and it was a very self-declaredly subjective exercise, all coming from our own different backgrounds and ethnicities, all just declaring, these are 10 moments where I think humans actually did change their minds about something substantial. And some of them are to be disputed. Most of us don't think the earth is flat anymore. Some of us still do. But a lot of us did change our minds about that. And it goes on and on. And really, that was the point, was then to locate each of these shifts of perspective so that you could walk into an environment and hang each moment on a map in space, because the understanding of the Memory Palace technique is that you will remember things better if you can hang them architecturally within the architecture of your mind. And that's something that we were trying to do in the piece.
And another maze is, of course, your work with trees. And that started all with you kind of creating a radical shift of perspective to a commission where you were told that you could do everything but not plant trees. So you planted trees anyhow. And that was at Somerset House. And a lot has happened since then. You've actually also created the COP26 project with a conference of trees. It's been a very important, in a way, line throughout your work in 21. Can you tell us more?
Again, I mean, we were talking earlier about working outside your depth. It was something that David Bowie apparently said to someone, they mentioned it on the radio last week, that if ever you can just about touch the ground, just move a little further out to sea so you're not quite comfortable. And with landscape and trees, I am absolutely out of my depth. I know nothing, but I want to learn, and I feel embarrassed to not know the names of the species that I live with in my city. I know that there are 400 species of moth. I know that there are 148 species of tree. It's impolite of me to not know their names. We were talking at lunch about caring and curation and curiosity, and the fact that those three words come from the same stem. And if we don't care, if we're not curious, how can we care? And if we don't care, how can we curate? And if we don't curate and look after, then how will things survive? So it came out of that instinct. And in fairness to Somerset House, they did say you can do anything except put trees there.
And you did it anyhow. Now I was thinking, in order to make it participatory, you actually wrote for our Serpentine project back to us. We did a book also dedicated to Gustav Metzger's memory, kind of DIY instructions of what we can do in relation to the extinction crisis, the environmental crisis. And you did a very beautiful piece, a DIY piece. So we discussed before that maybe it's a nice thing that you read it because we can then all do it.
Okay, here's my list of instructions. If you have an idle moment, find a photograph of two trees. Find an X-ray image of the two bronchial trees within a pair of human lungs. Trace over both. Overlay the two tracings. Contemplate the visual connection. The bifurcating geometry that defines both. The structures inside us that allow us to breathe. The structures outside us that render the air breathable. As you breathe in, visualize the 600 million alveoli, like leaves on the branches of the bronchial trees within your lungs. As you breathe out, visualize the stomata on the leaves of the 3 trillion trees which make your breathing possible. If you have $8, go to www.institutoterra.org and plant a tree. Think of it growing as you breathe.
Thank you so much. Now, another question, and that connects actually somehow to the conversation also before with Pamela Rosenkrantz and David Ademan, where they talked about their collaboration. And Pamela talked a lot about connecting many different disciplines, and you spoke about an interesting parallels between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. And I think it's interesting in relation to the Bergsonian theme to hear a little bit more about that, because we can, of course, make a transversal connection between language and the environment, which is also something actually Suleiman Bachar-Diagne, the philosopher whose conversation for E.A.T you can see online because he cannot be here with us, he addressed that in relation to translation, and of course makes us also think about conceptions of time and memory. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your interest in parallels between linguistic diversity and biodiversity, because it brings us also to your work with AI. It brings us to your work you did for the Serpentine with Google, where basically a collective poem with an AI collaboration was built, and then, of course, brings us to the pavilion in Dubai.
I'm going to hold 2 fingers here to remember to 1, get to the Serpentine, 2, get to the poem. But firstly, to answer the first point, we were touching on this at lunch, actually. How do we actually, render any of this actually viscerally, palpable? And if we think about David Attenborough, who is probably the person who has, done more in many ways to bring the climate crisis home to us through the vivid and extraordinarily beautiful images that he brings and the craft with which, the hours that go into filming that. But in a way, if we think about the tone of it, it was, in my childhood, almost romantic. The music was almost, sort of cinematic and romantic, and then there was a shift in tone, and it became elegiac, and it became nostalgic, and it became, elegiac, and in between, there wasn't quite, it was quite a sudden shift, let's say. So when you are looking for parallels to how you feel when you watch an Attenborough film of the last polar bear on the ice, how can you feel that linguistically? And we were reading through the list of endangered languages, and there are 7,000 languages spoken, of which I think about 2,000 are on the critically endangered list. And when you read through the list, it's on the Endangered Language Alliance site. It's pretty interesting. You start reading, oh, there's 2 million speak this, 400, 300, 200, and then you get down to the 8 people speak this language. The 3 people speak this language. And then there's quite a lot of languages, you know, many of them South American dialects or African dialects, where there's only one person who speaks it. And then you get down to the extinct languages. And what you feel is similar to how you feel when you're seeing The Last Black Rhino. It has that sensation, and it helps, I think, to help us connect to caring for something that's other. So that was thing one. Thing two, poetry. This came about because Hans Ulrich invited me to look at something on the evening of the Serpentine annual gathering. And really, it was a little bit of a response to the first time I visited the Serpentine, was the Felix Gonzalez Torres exhibition that Hugo curated in 2000. And I remember at the time being so struck by the terms of engagement with that piece that we were invited to engage in, which was, here's a pile of silver sweets, take them. Here's a pile of art, take it. Which, growing up in the 80s in Britain, as I did, in a Thatcher's Britain, was shocking to me. For me, the way I've been brought up was shocking. And I wanted to try and make an homage to that. So the thought was, everybody donate a word, something that's easy to donate. And out of this would come a collective poem. And we made the first one at the Serpentine. It then went on through a few other iterations and is now a speaking building, speaking ever-changing texts, sometimes quite profound, actually, sometimes nonsensical, which I thought was quite an appropriate expression of our country.
And also you told me at the time that you suddenly realized that you have to give identity and biography to the algorithm. You worked very closely with Ross Goodwin. Can you tell us a bit more about how this sort of algorithm evolved?
Well, yes, I think as you were touching on earlier, the responsibility is in the training. It's like teaching a child. I was sitting, in fact, with Kyle MacDonald, who trained the algorithm for the UK Pavilion in the end, and spent many, many, many months with many curators from many different ethnicities, many different backgrounds, curating and training the algorithm, because it'll only behave as you teach it to behave. And I was sitting next to Kyle. We were actually both looking at something else while we were talking, and I just remember this thought dawning on me that actually it was a very terrifying responsibility to be in charge of everything that this algorithm would learn would come from what we gave it to read. And he gave me an example, actually. I had just done a TED talk and I had referred to a wonderful E.M. Forster text, which many of you will know about. Only connect is the last phrase of it. It's a very beautiful text. And we gave this text to the algorithm while it was being developed. And what the algorithm did with it was so terrifying. The end of that text is only connect and live in fragments no longer. And the algorithm wrote, only connect, live in fragments, die in fragments. And it went off on this terrible, and I said, where did you train it? He said, oh, it was trained on Reddit. So, I did learn quite a lot about the dangers involved with the bias in algorithms, for sure.
Now, to come to the drawings, I just wanted to kind of mention that what we see, are these many, many projects of yours. And in this incredible fluidity, we see how you kind of went from theater design to stage design to incredible, almost like architectures for music with ever-growing budgets. Because, of course, if you do stages for Billie Eilish or if you do stages for Kanye West, these are almost like temporary architectures for these concerts. We see then how you went into art installations, architecture. Now, when I asked you once what brings it all together, you said that you don't really see so much a difference because what you always want is magic. So I thought it would be great to sort of hear how you maybe about your trajectory, how you came from theater design to all these other fields, because it seems so fluid, so seamless. And how it all is connected through magic.
I think, coming back to memory palaces, I don't know if any of our architects in the audience feel the same way, but somehow the association between story and architecture was innate in me from quite a young age. And I don't know if that's true of everyone, because we're all brought up differently. I did have a specific set of circumstances in that when I was 6 years old, every weekend, not just sometimes, every weekend, my family, don't ask why, visited a model of the town that I lived in. So, and this little model had a sonnet lumière performed around it. So the houses in the town spoke. And because I was 6, and I've understood subsequently that something happens when you're 6 and your mind starts to sort of be wired a little more firmly than it is pre-6. But I think just around that time when my mind was being wired, I associated buildings with telling stories. Because the house I lived in was modeled in that model next to my house. And it would glow and it would tell a story about what happened in that house. And so for me, it was natural that buildings told stories. And that memories would be held within architectures. So I guess that may, by various byways, have led me towards stage design. And the practice of concert design has been around almost the design of musical instruments, the architecture for storytelling, the architecture for sound making. Because actually, when you design an opera, you are designing a musical instrument for the voices. There's one of these slides has a big oval, which I designed for Parsifal at the Danish National Opera. And the day that the chorus turned up in it, they said, well, it's perfect, except that it's too steep for us to walk on, and it's too loud for us to sing in, and you've given us one thing for the whole opera. So in the end, they put earplugs in, and it sounded great. But, that's aspect of a building as a musical instrument. I developed through there, I guess. And then really buildings as portraiture. When you're working with a large scale of a highly broadcast human individual, they're still a human individual, but they have to carry around with them this epic broadcast version of themselves. And I guess the LED that we use to broadcast them to a stadium is a sort of version of the precious lapis lazuli that would have been commissioned in a portrait of them in another time to broadcast their status, I guess. So all of that has led me, I guess, to emerge the other side and really question, so much of the practice leaves a terrible carbon footprint. I mean, the touring music is a disaster. It's, it's carbon emissions on an industrial scale. It's industrialized music. So it's really a case of how do we change that, which we're massively trying to do, and how do we begin to grow work? How can we make work that has a circular lifespan, and how can we grow it? So hence the, adventures into trying to grow things rather than just build them.
Thank you so much. I had a last question before we open it up for questions from the floor. I wanted to ask you, because you've realized, most of the things we saw in your drawings and then, of course, in the realized projects have been realized. I was very curious about your unrealized projects, things which have been too big to be realized, maybe also too expensive to be realized, or maybe too time-intense to be realized, or projects which have been censored. And then Doris Lessing always told me, there are also the projects we have which we don't dare to do. She said these are the kind of the self-censor projects. So within this whole range of the unrealized, I wanted to ask you to tell us maybe about one or two of your still unrealized projects.
I think this comes back to how we began the talk about the drawing after. And I would say that pretty much every time I sit, especially in the theatre work, we sit and we watch the sculpture animated by the performers every night. Every night, we go many nights, and we have time to meditate on it and to grieve for what it isn't and hope for what it could be in the next iteration. So almost every project becomes a sort of a practice of drawing after. I will sit and, there's one project that spins by in these, which is a rotating cube with one person sitting in it from a show called Chimerica at the Almeida Theatre in 2013. And the moment I sat down and looked at it on the opening night, I redesigned it into two sort of twin objects. It seemed to me that the play would be much better expressed by that. So almost everything that you see has been redrawn after it's been made, and it's those unrealized drawings that then go forth to become, the seed of the next thing usually.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause for S. Devlin. And I think we can now open it up for questions. If there are questions for us, the moment is now. Any questions? Yeah, we have a question here from Mikolaj Sekutovic. Mikolaj, there is a microphone coming. Yeah.
As you did this amazing work, this mirror maze for SUPERBLUE, and I saw here some drawings. Were they also like when you were 18, or is this such a long thought process? That would be super interesting for me. Then the second question would relate to this. What was the feeling to be able to realize this kind of, back then, unrealized project, and how this affected your creativity, and if this new canvas that SUPERBLUE somehow created, has a new quality also for you in working, and how you see the next, iteration going into this more immersive, more like conceptual spaces that can be really experienced as a full body experience.
So the project that Mikolaj is referring to, it's sort of come round. Maybe if you keep playing them, Jeremy, it'll come round again. It's the one of a large-scale piece in Miami at SUPERBLUE that Hans-Ulrich mentioned. So what I'm trying to work with there is something I feel that over 20 years I've been trying to, intuit. It's the terms of engagement of an audience, and can you shift them? So in this case, the audience arrive, and they go into a small room, and they watch a film. And the film, I would say, it's sort of modeled on an advert. It's 2.5 minutes long. It's my voice. It's a series of images. And you feel very clear, I think, as an audience member, what your terms of engagement are. You're watching, you're engaged, it's not too difficult, you're used to this tone of voice, you're used to this type of imagery. But then something changes, and the film splits apart, and a hole is rendered into the film. The doors open. And it's always shocking to people. People always go, they didn't expect it, because we are so used to fixed terms of engagement when we sit to watch something. So when the doors open, you don't quite know what to do, but you get a sense that you're being invited in. The feeling is positive. And then when you enter, you're walking into an environment that you've seen drawn and illustrated and explained in some ways, or sort of precursed or adumbrated in the film, and you become unscripted. You are then on your own. It's then up to you how you move. And that crossing of the threshold from passive to active, from fixed terms of engagement to unscripted terms of engagement is a thing. And I think it's an interesting place to work. So that's what the piece, it'll come up again. You can shout out when it comes. And the drawings that you saw, they were based on the invitation that Hans-Ulrich gave us all to write these duets. And if you've read through the book of Remember Nature, it's extraordinary how many people were writing parallel things. We were all thinking parallel things. And I started tracing over lungs and trees. I had probably first had the idea when I read James Gleick's book, Chaos, in 1987. He wrote a book which explains that obviously the maths that governs bifurcation is the same in lungs as it is in trees, because they're both trying to be as efficient as possible in exchanging gases. It's logical, really. But to me, who hadn't ever been taught that, it was new. So from those drawings came some small sculptures, and then from that came the design of the piece in Miami. Well, that was the process.
I have a follow-up question.
Can we have the microphone? A question from Grace.
Goes back to body, mind, and spirit, also like observer and being observed. So you mentioned amazement is a way you use to change people's mindset. So my question is, it's like if you are director of a movie, you are director, there's this actor, but when the actor is so good, you forget you are director. Your role, how do you maneuver? Because to change people, you have to change from the feeling level, not the intellectual level. So I first of all, I was extremely impressed by the talk between you two. And this fluid, it's art by itself. But like the observer and the being observed, body, mind, and spirit, what's the magic?
Okay, I have to answer something very important we didn't come to. I don't know if any of you are aware of the work of David Abram. He's
Yes.
a sleight-of-hand magician who became an eco-philosopher, with whom I'm completely obsessed, and I'm waiting for Hans-Ulrich to introduce me to him urgently. He has written 2 books, which I strongly recommend everyone to read, Becoming Animal and The Spell of the Sensuous. The Spell of the Sensuous briefly posits that the real point of departure between humans and other species was the invention of the phonetic alphabet, a point at which humans ceased to be really moored and anchored to their point of reference with language, because phonetics sort of disassociated ideographs or hieroglyphs from visually relating to their point of reference. But more interestingly, there's a story about David Abram in Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life, which many of you may have read on mycelium. And he tells this story, which I think is really pertinent to your point, to your question. David Abram was doing magic tricks at the table in a restaurant in Massachusetts. And by all accounts, 5 of the diners within 1 week complained to the management and said, that guy, that magician, is spiking our drinks. Because when we come out of the restaurant in the evening, the sky looks a weird, vivid blue color, much bluer than the sky ever is. And when we walk past the posters down the street, the posters are vivid and alive and much more vivid and colorful than they ever were. So the owner goes to David Abram and says, listen, what's going on? You know, these guys are all separately saying that you spiked their drinks. And David Abram, the sleight-of-hand magician, eco-philosopher, says, here's what's happening. If you destabilize people's perceptions and people's expectations about how coins and cards behave at a table, then you will destabilize their expectations about how anything behaves and about how blue the sky is and about how interesting the posters are. And I do think there's something in that. If you can just get under the bonnet of people's preconceptions with which we view everything. We don't look at the color of the sky. We look at the color we expect to see. So I think, to your point, magic, illusion, the things that happen in a theatre can be perhaps of some use in trying to just get under the skin of things we think we're closed to changing about ourselves and about our perceptions.
But when you play that, the observer and observed, yourself, are you one or you are separate?
Ask the question again.
When you play that, you know, there's observer, there's observed, do you come into one or you are separate? You separate observer and observed?
I mean, I think that would depend on each context. I think in the context of the SUPERBLUE piece that he was describing, I think there's a clear distinction, and I don't think it's so much a coming together, but a crossing of the threshold and a shift of responsibility from being told a story to being participant in a story, if that helps.
Thank you.
Can take one last question for us. Questions or comments? If not, I do have a last question, because whenever we meet, I'm very inspired by the books you recommend, by the online things you recommend. I remember some years ago you told me to read Kate Raworth, and that led actually to last year's incredible talk with Kate Raworth, with DLD and E.A.T about the donut economics. We very kind of first day the book Surveillance Capitalism came out, you urged me to immediately get hold of a copy, and we then subsequently discussed this book with the CEO of Google. So today you recommend us 2 things this morning. You told me that it's very urgent to look at David Abrams, which I think are going to order, and we definitely connect you to him, because I actually have already Googled it, and he is actually has worked with Rupert Sheldrake, with whom we work, so that should be easy to organize, but also you have said that you've been very inspired by online talks. Elena and Norman Foster have produced for the Foster Foundation. And obviously, Elena, we are very honored Elena and Norman are here with us today. And Norman did, of course, last year the wonderful talk, which was about the theme of long duration, which is online on the E.A.T website, you can all see. So I wanted to ask you, because you said this morning that these talks have deeply inspired you during the lockdown.
I mean, this was a case where, you know, Design, which is a lovely magazine online that I really value, and it brings a lot of work to my attention that I wouldn't have been aware of. But they ask you to do things like write a manifesto to celebrate their 15th birthday. So they asked 15 people to do it. And you know, with the British kind of cultural environment, that you're just standing up to be a target for, you know, it's definitely a source of potential humiliation to stand up and try and write a manifesto for anything. But anyway, we did it. And I had been watching all of the wonderful Foster Foundation talks on the city during the pandemic. And it really consoled me during that time to understand that so much of what we were going through in the pandemic had been gone through by citizens of this city before, and that, in fact, you know, the outcome on the fabric of the city and the systems of the city had been in the end positive. That, as you were saying earlier, we would not have had the Bazalgette embankment system if it hadn't been for cholera. There was all sorts of developments that wouldn't have happened had there not been these moments of pandemic. And one of the talks that in fact, I watched many, all of them, on the city, and specifically because when asked to write a manifesto, again, perhaps being too, you know, stupid, but I thought, I'm going to write a manifesto about something I know nothing about, but I would like to happen. The question was, what 15 things do you think would create a better future? And it wasn't really about my own practice. It was about actually the city centre. Could we make a city centre that had a higher percentage of tree cover? Could we make a city centre that was devoid of vehicles? And I needed to learn about that. So I watched Robin's talk, I've forgotten her surname now, from Zipcar, who have absolutely, you know, every single detail on how this system could work. And there was lots of other speakers as well who were incredibly informative. So, yeah, the manifesto was that. I got largely pilloried for it, for saying I didn't know what I was talking about, which I didn't. But it's still the aspiration that I have. So thanks for, you know, those talks, which made me less ignorant than I was, for sure.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for S. Devlin.
Thank you. You better keep that one.